welcome to another episode of Belongs to the Shadows. I'm your creepy host, Jaime Bennett. And why do I look like this, you might ask? It's because today's topic is Vlad the Impaler, also Dracula, and the correlation between the two. Are they one and the same? I will also be discussing other vampiric topics. So sit back and enjoy today's episode. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about is Vlad the Impaler and why people believe that he was actually the real life Dracula. This first story that I'm going to be, or the first thing that I'm going to be telling you, comes from an article that you can find on nbcnews.com/sciencemain/Vlad Impaler Real Dracula was absolutely vicious. If you want to read more about it, it was written by Mark Lanilla and it came out October 31st of 2013. And so here we go. Very few names has cast more terror into the human heart than that of Dracula. The legendary vampire had been created by the author Bram Stoker, of course, for his novel that was created in 1897 of the same name. It had inspired countless horror movies, television shows, and other blood-curdling tales of vampires. And it still continues today. There's still movies, books, and everything else being written about vampires. I am a lover of movies that are about vampires and books that are about vampires. One of my favorite authors is Bram Stoker, of course, as well as Anne Rice. Though Dracula may have seemed like a singular creation of Stoker's, in fact, Stoker drew inspiration from a real-life man with an even more grotesque taste for blood. Vlad III, or as he is better known, Vlad the Impaler, a name that he had earned for his favorite way of dispensing with his enemies. Vlad III was born in 1431 in Transylvania, a mountainous region in modern-day Romania. His father, Vlad II, Dracula, ruler of Wallachia, a principality located to the south of Transylvania. Vlad II was granted the surname Dracula, which means or translates to dragon. After his induction into the Order of the Dragon, a Christian military order supported by Holy Roman Empire, which was situated between Christian Europe and the Muslim lands of Ottoman Empire. Transylvania and Wallachia were frequently the scene of bloody battles. The Ottoman forces had pushed westward into Europe, and Christian crusaders repulsed the invaders or marched eastward toward the Holy Land. When Vlad II was called to a diplomatic meeting in 1442 with Sultan Murad II, he brought his young sons, Vlad III and Radu, along. But the meeting was actually a trap. Surprise, surprise. All three were arrested and held hostage. The elder Vlad was released under the condition that he leave his sons behind. Years of captivity. Under the Ottomans, Vlad and his younger brother were tutored in science, as well as philosophy and the arts. Vlad also became a skilled horseman and warrior. Surprise, surprise again. According to some accounts, however, he may also have been imprisoned and tortured for part of that time, during which he would have witnessed the impalement of his Ottoman enemies. The rest of Vlad's family, however, fared even worse. His father was ousted as ruler of Wallachia by local warlords, boyars, and was killed in the swamps near Baltini, Wallachia, in 1447. Vlad's older brother, Murcia, was tortured, blinded, and buried alive. Whether these events turned Vlad III, Dracula, son of the dragon, into a ruthless killer could be a matter of historical speculation. What is certain, however, is that once Vlad had been freed from the Ottoman captivity, shortly after his family's death, his reign of blood began. In the year 1453, the city of Constantinople fell to the Ottomans, threatening all of Europe with an invasion. Vlad was charged with leading a force to defend Wallachia from an invasion. His 1456 battle to protect his homeland was victorious. Legend still holds that he personally beheaded his opponent, Vladislav II, in a one-on-one combat. So yes, Vlad the Impaler earned his name for sure. Though he had now become the ruler of Principality of Wallachia, his lands were in ruinous state due to constant warfare and the internal strife caused by feuding boyars. Consolidate, I'll get it out eventually, to consolidate power, there we go, Vlad invited hundreds of them to a banquet, knowing his authority would be challenged. He had his guests stabbed, and their still twitching bodies impaled. What is impaling, you ask? If you do not know what impaling is, you're about to find out. Impaling is a particularly gruesome form of torture and death. A wood or metal pole is inserted through the body, either front to back or vertically, through the rectum or worse. The exit wound could be near the victim's neck, shoulders, or mouth. In some cases, the pole was rounded, not sharp, to avoid damaging internal organs and thereby prolonging the suffering of the victim. The pole was then raised vertically to display the victim's torment. It could take hours or days for the impaled person to die. Though Vlad was widely credited with bringing order and stability to Wallachia, his rule was indisputably vicious. Dozens of Saxon merchants in Kronstadt, I hope I pronounced that right, who were once allied with the boyars, were also impaled in 1459. The Ottoman Turks were never far from Vlad's thoughts or his borders. When diplomatic envoys had an audience with Vlad in 1459, the diplomats were declined to remove their hats, citing a religious custom, commending them on their religious devotion. Vlad ensured that their hats would forever remain on their heads by having the hats nailed to the diplomats' skulls. Oh my gosh, that is terrifying. Vlad definitely has earned the title of Vlad the Impaler, and yeah, I can see why people believe him to be the real-life Dracula. During one of his many successful campaigns against the Ottomans, Vlad wrote to a military ally in 1462, and in quotes, he says, "I have killed peasants, men and women, old and young, who lived at Oldesiza and Novolciolo." Not sure how you pronounce those. Where the Danube flows into the sea. We killed 23,884 Turks without counting those whom we burned in homes or the Turks whose heads were cut by our soldiers. Thus, your highness, you must know I have broken the peace. Vlad's victories over the invading Ottomans were celebrated throughout Wallachia, Transylvania, and the rest of Europe. Even Pope Pius II was impressed. But Vlad also earned a much darker reputation. On one occasion, he reportedly dined among the veritable forest of defended warriors, writhing on impaled poles. It's not known whether tales of Vlad III Dracula dipping his bread in the blood of his victims is true, but stories about his unspeakable sadism swirled throughout Europe. Tens of thousands killed in total. Vlad is estimated to have killed about 80,000 people through various means. This includes some 20,000 people who were impaled and put on display outside the city at Targovist. The sight was so repulsive that the invaded Ottoman Sultan Muhammad II, after seeing the scale of Vlad's carnage and the thousands of decaying bodies being picked apart by the birds, the crows, turned back and retreated to Constantinople. In 1476, while marching to yet another battle with the Ottomans, Vlad and a small vanguard of soldiers were ambushed, and Vlad was killed and beheaded. By most reports, his head was delivered to Muhammad II in Constantinople as a trophy to be displayed above the city gates. Could you imagine that? I would not wanted to have lived during that time. That would have been very, very terrifying and definitely the thing of nightmares. So it's no wonder he earned his title of Vlad the Impaler. I couldn't think of a more suitable name for him, honestly, other than Dracula. The Middle Ages were notoriously violent, and the name of Vlad III, Dracula, may have been a mere historical footnote were it not for an 1820 book by the British consul to Wallachia, William Wilkinson, an account of the principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia, with various political observations relating to them. Wilkinson had delved into the history of the region. He had mentioned the notorious warlord Vlad Tepes. Stoker, who had never visited Vlad's homeland. Isn't that surprising? He had never visited Vlad's homeland. Was nonetheless known to have read Wilkinson's book. So there you go. There's where he got his idea. And if ever there were a historical figure to inspire a bloodthirsty, monstrous, fictional character, Vlad III Dracula was definitely one. The next article that I'm going to be reading from is called The Real Dracula, and you can find it on heritagedaily.com/2020/06/The Real Dracula. So, the real Dracula, ? Dracula, of course, like I said earlier, was published in 1897 by the Irish author Bram Stoker. He introduced audiences to the infamous Count in his dark world of sire vampiric minions. The person who wrote this article, it doesn't really say, but if you want to read more of this article, you can definitely find it on heritagedaily.com, like I said. Stoker's work would go on to influence a cultural fascination, and it also established the conventions of vampire fantasy that we've come to popularize across various media platforms. Before the story of Dracula was concocted, the concept of a blood-sucking spirit or demon consuming human flesh was told in the mythology and folktales of almost every civilization throughout the centuries. Stoker would spend several years researching the Central and East European folklore for mythological stories on the supernatural. One of the earliest vampiric depictions that he uncovered stems from cuneiform texts by the Akkadians, Sumerians, Assyrians, and the Babylonians, where they referred to demonic figures such as Lilu and Litu. This myth became synonymous in Jewish folklore and the Babylonian Talmud, giving rise to the demon Lilith. Lilith is translated to night creature. So around 300 to 500 AD, she would often be depicted as a sexually wanton demon who steals babies in the night to feast on their blood. Lilith also would appear as Adam's first wife in the alphabet as Sirach, written between 700 and 100 AD. It wasn't until the late 17th and 18th century that the folklore for vampires, as we imagine, began to be told in the verbal traditions and lore of many European ethnic groups. They were described as the revenants of evil beings, suicide victims, witches, corpses possessed by a malevolent spirit, or the victim of a vampiric attack that had resulted in their own viral ascension to vampirism. During the 18th century, vampire sightings across Eastern Europe had reached its peak, with frequent exhumations and the practice of staking to kill potential revenants. I would not have wanted to live during that time period. Not only do you have to worry about like diseases and dying at an early age, you have to worry about being staked because somebody would mistake you as being a vampire. That's scary. This period was commonly referred to as the 18th century vampire controversy. Imagine that. Makes sense. 18th century poetry and literature reflect the public hysteria of the time, with poems like The Vampire, that was written in 1748 by Henrik August Ossenfelder, and stories such as John Polidori's The Vampire in 1819, featuring the vampire Lord Ruthven, that culminated in Stoker's preeminent vampire novel. The catalyst for Stoker's work is argued to stem from the tales regaled by Armin van Buuren, a Hungarian Jewish writer, whilst another arguable source is the book The Land Beyond the Forest, which was written in 1890, an essay, Transylvanian Superstitions, by Emily Gerard, which certainly introduced Stoker to the term Nosferatu, which I will get to later on in this. I know that the title of this episode is Vlad the Impaler / Dracula, but you can't have an episode on Dracula without talking about Nosferatu. We've got to mention that brilliant work. According to the 1972 book In Search of Dracula, Radu Florescu and Raymond McNally championed the theory that was originally proposed by Basil Kirtley, that Stoker's research culminated in him basing Dracula on the voivode of Wallachia. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I'm bad about butchering names. Vlad III Dracula, also known as Vlad the Impaler or Vlad Tepes. The scholars had connected the two figures through a matching biographical namesake. Both Count Dracula and Vlad III Dracula also shared similarities in their personal clashes with the neighboring Ottomans, highlighted during a conversation in Chapter 3 of the book. So that is really, really interesting. Like, you know, a lot of people don't realize that Dracula did exist. I feel like Dracula existed, especially, since Bram Stoker pretty much based a book on, his research of a real life person, like somebody who lived back in the past and has so many similarities to Dracula. I just find all this to be completely fascinating, and I just absolutely love researching this. I've loved researching this. I'm reading a lot of this stuff for the first time as I'm reading it to you all. So it's very, very interesting to be finding this stuff out as I'm reading it to you. But I already knew some of it because I'm a huge fan of Dracula. I love all of that stuff. One of my favorite books is actually based on Vlad the Impaler, and it's called The Historian. So if you actually want to read a book that's very well written, very, very in-depth detail, exciting, rich with just, the culture, gives your imagination like a run for its money, because like it's an amazing book, and I could carry on and on about it. So if you all want to read a really, really good vampire book or a really good book about Vlad the Impaler or based on Vlad the Impaler, go check out The Historian, because it is a great book. In the conversation, Dracula refers to the void of the Dracula race who fought against the Turks after the defeat in the Battle of Kosovo. Kosovo. Let's retry that. Tired, y'all. Who was it but one of my own? This is in quotations, and it comes from the book. Who was it but one of my own race who, as Voivod, crossed the Danube and beat the Turk on his own ground? This was a Dracula indeed. Woe was it that his own unworthy brother, when he had fallen, sold his people to the Turk and brought the shame of slavery on them. Was not this Dracula indeed who inspired that other of his race who in a later age again and again brought his forces over the great river into Turkey land, who, when he was beaten back, came again and again, though he had to come alone from the bloody field where his troops were being slaughtered, since he knew that he alone could ultimately triumph. It comes from chapter 3, page 19. This is reinforced in chapter 18 when the story's character, Professor von Helsing, yes, Helsing, I love that, referred to a letter from his friend Arminus. He must indeed have been that Voivod Dracula who won his name against the Turk over the great river on very frontier of Turkeyland. And that's chapter 18, page 145. These speeches had shown elements that Stoker directly copied from an account of the principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia, with various political observations relating to them. That's in quotations, and that's by William Wilkinson. Vlad III Dracula. Vlad III Dracula was the Voivod of Wallachia, having lived between the years of 1428 and 1431, is often considered one of the most important rulers in Wallachian history and a national hero of Romania to this day. I think that they might have wrote the years wrong, but that's what it's saying on this page, so we're just going to go with it. The second son of Vlad Dracula, a member of the Order of the Dragons, called the Draculesti, Vlad III and his brother were known as Dracula, translated as son of Dracul. Yeah, this is very, very interesting. I absolutely love, reading this for the first time to you all because I'm finding out things right along with you. And I absolutely love doing episodes like this because, like I said, I'm a huge fan of Dracula, and it's so interesting to do research on this for these episodes. So this is fascinating. I absolutely love it. Vlad Dracula was supplanted and murdered by Vladislav II in 1447, which led to a series of successive wars by Vlad III to retake the throne of Wallachia in 1456. Vlad III defeated Vladislav II, started to strengthen his hold of his region. He began by purging the Wallachian boyars, nobility of the Danubian principalities, who he believed played a role in the death of his father as well as his brother. Leonikos Chalcondyles, hopefully I said that right, it's a very long name, chronicles stated that Vlad quickly effected a great change and had utterly revolutionized the affairs of Wallachia through granting money, property, and other goods to his victims, to his retainers. He then turned his attentions to the Transylvanian Saxons, who had supported his enemies and plundered the villages around Brasov and Sibiu. German propaganda had told stories of Vlad ordering all the inhabitants to Wallachia and had them impaled or burnt alive. Yeah, Vlad was not a nice guy. So it's no wonder that there's a correlation between Vlad the Impaler and Dracula. It makes a lot of sense. And I really, really do believe that Vlad the Impaler was actually Dracula. The real threat to Vlad, as well as his nation, was the neighboring Ottoman Empire, which I had mentioned several times before. Vlad had failed to pay the jizya, the tax on jizya. It's spelled Jizya. I hope I'm not butchering that. Tax on non-Muslims to Sultan Muhammad II for the past 3 years, which culminated in Vlad taking the offensive. He had campaigned across the Danube by attacking villages and stormed the fortress of Gurugu, resulting in the death of over 23,000 Turks and Bulgarians. Having learned of Vlad's invasion, Muhammad II had raised an army of more than 150,000 strong, with the objective to conquer Wallachia and annex it to his empire. The two leaders fought a series of skirmishes, culminating in a failed night attack near the city of Targovist by Vlad III in an attempt to kill Muhammad. Muhammad proceeded to march on the city, finding little resistance. But after leaving Targovist, he discovered the horrific remains of 23,844 impaled Turkish prisoners, arranged in concentric circles. I'm so sorry, y'all. I am so tired. I know I say that probably every time I do a show, but I am exhausted. But I love doing these shows. During his reign, Vlad is said to have also killed from 40,000 to 100,000 European civilians, political rivals, criminals, and anyone that he considered useless to humanity, mainly by impaling them. That's scary. That is very, very scary. As convincing as Vlad III's theory suggests, this was always contested by Stoker's son, Irving Stoke, who had claimed that the creation of Dracula was due to a nightmarish dream his father had had after eating dressed crab. That's very interesting. I find that to be fascinating. Could you imagine if it was actually from a nightmare after eating dressed crab? Wow, what a nightmare. Um, that's very interesting. Further footnotes copied from Wilkinson's book by Stoker state that Dracula and Walkian language means devil. This footnote further explained that Walkians gave the name Dracula to people who were especially courageous, cruel, or cunning. They had never mentioned the name of Vlad III, the connection to the Order of the Dragons, nor Vlad III's life was a direct source of inspiration for Stoker, despite previous assumptions. There's another theory that was formed by Barbara Belford. She argues that Stoker's close friend and employer, the actor Sir Henry Irving, 1838 to 1905, was actually Stoker's inspiration for the character traits of Dracula. In Bram Stoker, a biography of the author of Dracula, Barbara Belford connects the venerated actor to the fictional vampire, describing Irving as an egotist, a striking, mesmerizing figure, and a demanding employer. So that is very, very interesting. So yeah, you can definitely read more of this in the article if you want to read on. So do you all believe that Vlad the Impaler was the inspiration for Bram Stoker's Dracula? Do you believe that Dracula actually existed? I think that it's possible. I think that, maybe he wasn't exactly the way that they portray vampires. Maybe he didn't have like the long teeth, and maybe he didn't suck on people's necks to get blood, but I think that there was probably a Dracula type person who existed. And I think that Vlad the Impaler was a pretty good bet that he was actually Dracula. This next article comes from time.com, and it's Bram Stoker Dracula history. I obviously I'm going to be talking about Bram Stoker a lot in this because, hello, I mean, he's a big part of this, a huge part of this. Bram Stoker is a genius, and absolutely am fascinated with Dracula. So, yeah. So, Bram Stoker claimed that parts of Dracula were actually real. And here's what Time magazine knows about the story behind the novel. In quotations, there are mysteries that man can only guess at which age by age may only solve in part. Bram Stoker. In the summer of 1890, a 45-year-old Bram Stoker entered the subscription library in Whitby, England, and requested a specific title. The Accounts of Principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia by William Wilkinson. That title wasn't a title that was readily found on the shelves or typically made available to the general public. The library didn't even make it known that they had possessed such a rare book. Access was only granted to those who asked for it. Patrons handled the title only under the watchful eye of the librarian, and it was returned to its resting place the moment business concluded. Upon receipt of the book, Stoker didn't read it cover to cover or browse the text. He opened the pages specifically to certain sections, made notes in his journal, and returned the tome to the librarian. He had stopped next at the Whitby Museum. where he had reviewed a series of maps and pieced together a route beginning in the heart of London and ending upon a mountaintop deep within the wilds of Romania. A latitude and longitude previously noted in his journal and confirmed again this very day. From the museum, Bram then made his way to Whitby Harbor, where he had spoke to several members of the Royal Coast Guard. They had provided details of a sailing vessel, the Dimitri, that ran aground a few years earlier on the beach inside Protective Harbor, with only a handful of the remaining crew still yet alive. The ship, which originated in Varna, an Eastern European port, was carrying a mysterious cargo, crates of earth. While investigating the damaged ship, rescue workers had reported seeing a large black dog, consistent with a Yorkshire myth of a beast known as Barghest. Escape from the hull of the ship and run up 199 steps from Tate Sands Beach into the graveyard of St. Mary's Church. Stoker had looked up at the church in Whitby Abbey. Whitby Abbey, that's a mouthful, looming beside it on the cliff. In his mind's eye, he had pictured the dark chamber at the top of the central tower. Opening his journal, he had turned to the information he had written down back at the library. Dracula and Wallachia language means devil. Wallachians were accustomed to give it a surname to any person who rendered himself conspicuous either by courage, cruel actions, or cunning. So 4 months earlier, at a diner at the Beefsteak Club, or at dinner at the Beefsteak Club of Lyceum Theatre in London, Bram Stoker's friend Arminius Vanbury had told him of the book, told him what to look for, told him to visit the library in Whitby, the final piece of a decades-old puzzle, a story slowly taking shape. On another page of his notes, the name Count Wimpire had recently been crossed out, replaced with Count Dracula, and to Bram, it had all made sense now. For fans of the novel Dracula, the information above that I just read to you all takes on a familiar note. We all know the name. There's the graveyard, the abbey, the dog, and of course the ship. But was it actually called the Demeter, right? Not Dimitri? In the book, yes, but in real life it was Dimitri, and there was a real life Bram. A real life Bram had found a blurry place between fact and fiction. And that surely put a smile on Bram's face. That's very, 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 very interesting. I love reading that, when authors do research to come up with characters, it's very interesting to learn of their, thought process, to learn of their writing methods, to learn how did they come upon this story? Like, is there truth to the story, or is it just all made up? And like I said, I believe that a Dracula existed. Maybe he wasn't a vampire like how we know vampires or how they're portrayed in movies and in books, but it's just all fascinating to me. And like I said, if you all want to read a really, really good book with really good imagery in it, I really strongly suggest reading The Historian, because that is one of my favorite books. And I don't normally read books like that, but it just kept my attention at every turn of the pages. Like, every turn of the pages, it kept my attention, and I kept wanting to devour the book. Like, I loved it so much. It was such a good book. I had actually given that book as a gift to my mother-in-law, and she read it, and then she traded it in for other books, and I loved it so much that I had to get my hands on another copy. And thank goodness my husband actually found me another copy, because I could probably read that book like 10 times. I love it so much. And I don't normally act that way with books, but that book is so well written, and it is such a good book. So if you really like vampires and you really want to read an interesting book about Vlad the Impaler, I strongly suggest the history. And of course, I cannot do an episode about Dracula or Vlad the Impaler without mentioning the castle that is linked to the myth of Dracula, which is Bran Castle. You can find this information on historyhit.com/location/Bran-castle. So I'm going to give a shout out to a couple of YouTubers. This episode is not sponsored by them. I'm just going to give a shout out to them because they're completely awesome, and I love watching their shows. And they actually visited Bran Castle, and they did some investigations there, like, haunting investigations, ghost investigations. You should check out their channel. It's Sam and Colby. They have like an awesome channel. They visit places like Bran Castle, and they do investigations. And that's what I'm hoping to eventually accomplish with this show. I am always looking for sponsors. I'm going to shamelessly put that out there. And I am actually involved in a contest right now called Face of Horror, and I can win $13,000. And I'm hoping to use some of that money, if I win, to make this show better and to actually film on locations like Sam and Colby. That would be awesome. So Bran Castle is the name of the castle that is linked to the myth of Dracula. It is an impressive medieval castle located in Romania, which actually has very little to do with the famous vampire legend, but it is still worth a visit, though. They do call this Dracula's Castle because anytime you type in Dracula's Castle, Bran Castle 95% of the time is going to be coming up. Here is about Bran Castle. Commanding a strategic crossroads for hundreds of years, Bran Castle in Romania is an impressive medieval castle and a popular tourist attraction, famously known as Dracula's Castle. Bran, in fact, has little or no link to any of the legends surrounding the fictional vampire, or even the genuine figure of Vlad the Impaler, or who the character is loosely based upon. The history of Bran Castle. It was built on the orders of King Louis I of Hungary. Bran Castle was completed in just a few years around 1377, and it had served as an important strategic stronghold in an area which was often involved in local and regional conflicts. Frequently garrisoned by mercenaries, one interesting note, Tarnava mentions brigades of English ballista men serving at the castle. The castle was modified a number of times over the centuries and was occasionally a focal point in the conflicts of the region, most notably in the year of 1442 when it withstood a siege from the Ottoman forces. There's the Ottoman forces again. It also served as an important trading and customs post, generating significant income for local towns. Over time, the military importance of Bran Castle diminished, and it became an important political center and residence. In 1920, Bran Castle became an official palace of the Romanian royal family, and the famous Queen Maria played an important role in its restoration, development, and decor, as she did with many of the royal residences at the time. In terms of its links to Dracula, here we go. Bran Castle doesn't seem to be an obvious choice. While the figure upon which the vampire is loosely based, Vlad the Impaler, was a prisoner of the Hungarian king Matthias Corvinus. I can't pronounce these names. I'm sorry if I'm butchering them. Here for about 2 months in 1462, there is little more that connects them. But according to the account on the official website, it was American tourists in the 1970s and the 1980s who had established the link due to the castle's location and the exterior design. However it had happened, the myth has superseded the reality, and today, as well as exploring the castle's exterior and stately interior, tourists have to navigate a sea of pointed tooth merchandise. Yep. So, Bran Castle today is extremely atmospheric. And whilst its links to Dracula are best known, Queen Maria gets just as much airtime in the castle's displays and stories. The castle is open year-round, but it is closed on Mondays, with shorter hours during the winter. Makes sense. That makes complete sense. If you go during Halloween time, there's extensive and ghoulish program of events and tours. The views from the castle across the surrounding landscape are glorious, particularly in the summertime. So how do you get to Bran Castle itself? It is in a tiny village 30 kilometers southwest of Brasov. You'll need to drive via the DN1 and the DN73 to get there. Public transportation options are non-existent. So yeah, that's the history of Bran Castle, and that's the castle that is known as Dracula's Castle. Makes sense because of its location and the way it looks. If you go to look up Bran Castle on the internet, absolutely gorgeous. And if you want to see people actually visiting the castle and doing investigations, I highly suggest you check out Sam and Colby's channel, because they actually did go to Bran Castle, and it's a really, really good episode. I love all of their episodes because they put so much work and so much time and so much research into their shows. So I have a lot of respect for them. All right, so last but not least, I told you all I'm going to be talking about Nosferatu. So, how is Nosferatu different from Dracula, you may ask yourself? Nosferatu not only lacks the gentlemanly qualities of Dracula, the virile appearances and artfully manipulative abilities of many other vampires, Nosferatu is unaware that such qualities exist. And unlike Dracula, the dour, lonely Nosferatu does not know that he can turn his impulses into a game. I went and seen Nosferatu for the first time at a Chicago horror movie marathon. It was fascinating. Absolutely loved that horror movie marathon. They kept the theater. It was in an old-fashioned theater with a stage, and they kept it super ice cold because, environmental reasons. They wanted to make you feel like you were in a freezing cold, scary atmosphere, and it worked. It was 24 hours. I only lasted for a few hours because I did not bring a blanket, didn't bring a pillow, was tired, was hungry, and freezing half to death. But I got to actually see Nosferatu with a gentleman who was playing the live organ during the showing of Nosferatu, and it made it more exciting. And he would laugh. He would give a wicked laugh during the movie. So I absolutely loved it. Loved every moment of it. I actually got to meet a director of a horror film. So that was interesting. So yeah, I had a lot of fun at that, horror movie marathon. I went with my best friend who lives in Chicago. And I really wish that I would have made it through the 24 hours because I think that it would have been very, very interesting. But what I had seen there, what movies I had watched there, what live stage performances they had done while I was there, well worth it. Absolutely loved every minute of it. I just wish I would have lasted longer. So, without further ado, I hope that you all really enjoyed this episode of Belongs to the Shadows. Stay tuned after this episode for a special message. I hope that you enjoyed that episode of Belongs to the Shadows, and I hope you took a huge bite out of all the information that I gave you. Until next time, stay spooky. Hello, Jaime Bennett, the host of Belongs to the Shadows. I wanted to take a moment to let you all know that I am running for a contest called The Face of Horror. You get a free vote per day, but if you were to pay for votes to help me out and to help me maybe become the winner, that money goes to a really, really good cause, a very important cause called the B Plus Foundation. And what that is it's the largest provider of financial assistance to families dealing with pediatric cancer. So if you pay for votes, that money will go to a wonderful cause. So please vote for me to win the Face of Horror. If I win, I will be donating some of my winnings.